Welcome, one and all, to the channel Evan Writes. Today I've got something rather interesting for us to talk about. And what would that be? Another honest book review. Mostly honest. Probably honest. Just take my word. First and foremost, how did you guys like my 3-minute paint over of my face? It was pretty cool. I became Kavoth a lot faster than he did. Yeah. Anyway, I know it's lame rapid art, but hey, fits the theme. I had a loop. And, well, I think it's a pretty good introduction to a story all about the man, Kavoth. Today I'm going to go ahead and review a book I just finished reading last night, actually, called The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, this book had been, well, on my reading list for a long time. People wouldn't stop talking about it, telling me to read it. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, I had it on my bookshelf over there for probably 7 years before I actually got it down to read it. Now, before I get into the actual review, yes, I am glad I finally read it. It was an interesting read. For the most part, I enjoyed what I read. Now, that's not to say that this book was without its faults. I enjoyed a lot of it, but there were a lot of downsides to this book. And I hesitate a little bit to go into those because I know that this book is so well loved by the majority of people. But this wouldn't be an honest book review if I didn't go about the review honestly. Before I get into the actual review, I will go ahead and tell everybody that I plan to keep this a spoiler-free review. At the very end, I might talk about a few things that go into the spoiler territory, and if I do, I will go ahead and let you know that you can go ahead and leave the video if you are afraid of spoilers. But for the most part, I think I can talk about what I want to talk about in this book without spoiling anything that wasn't pre-established pretty early on in the book. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and explain more or less for those of you who are not familiar with the book The Name of the Wind, what it's about. The book The Name of the Wind starts off with a barkeeper named Kote, who goes about his daily motions. He's a pretty interesting character. The first couple of chapters are about him and his inn and the people who come and visit him, and we get the feeling that there's a lot to his backstory that we don't know. And pretty early on it's revealed that there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and that he's a pretty famous individual in this world setting. Kote tells his story to a man named the Chronicler. Now, the Chronicler is simply a scribe who collects and writes down stories. We pretty much find out that he's written a lot of books about people, about creatures, about a lot of those things, and in a way, he's famous in his own right. So we hear this innkeeper, Kote, tell his story in the first person to this man named the Chronicler. Now, that sets up the stage for a pretty interesting way of storytelling. The story itself takes place in the third person in the present time, where the man who originally was named Kavoth has assumed the name of Kote and has become a bartender who recounts his story. We get the impression that he's hiding, or that there's stuff that he just doesn't want to do anymore, so he's assumed a normal life. And it's a very interesting premise, I'd say. It was very exciting to start off in, and it got me interested in the book pretty early on. Kote starts off at the very beginning of his story, back when he was but a child, traveling as a trooper with his family. Now, that's kind of like a carny or somebody who goes around and does plays, sings music, does shows. It's just like a traveling show group. And that was his backstory. That's where he started off. And from there, he tells his story and it goes on. And that is the premise of the book. Before I go any farther, just to let you know, if you are interested in the book based on my review, go ahead and click the link down below to an Amazon page where you can buy the book. And all in all, I would say I enjoyed the read. It has its flaws, yes, but I believe it is worth a read for any avid fantasy reader or readers in general. I think it's just very well written. I enjoyed it. And overall, even though I would only give it about 3.5 stars out of 5, I still believe it is worth a read. Mainly because it was just very interesting and kept me going through as I read. With all its flaws and everything, I still enjoyed the read. That being said, we're going to go ahead and start off with the good of The Name of the Wind. And something that I want to start off with that you've probably heard, if you've heard anything about this book, is the writing style. I really enjoyed the writing style. It was poetic, it was musical, without being too much so. It kept me interested, and I really enjoyed his prose. It is the strongest part of this book to me. It didn't go too far, and it wasn't too little. It was just the perfect amount that I believe he is a very good storyteller. He uses his words artfully, and I really enjoyed that about him. And I believe that a lot of people are with me on that, just the overall writing style of The Name of the Wind was one of the high points of the book itself. That he could write almost anything, and just the way he writes would make people want to read through it, whether it was a crap fest or not. Moving on to the next pro is the overall magic system of the world. Now, based on the story's name, The Name of the Wind, you instantly think that the magic system of the world revolves around naming, the type of magic system that revolves around true names, which is very common in fantasy and isn't one of my favorites. I don't particularly enjoy that type of magic. It's just a little boring and basic to me. But the main type of magic within the world of The Name of the Wind is not naming, at least not in this book. And that's why I found it so interesting. The magic system is referred to as sympathy. Sympathy is almost a scientific way of approaching magic. It reminds me a lot of how Brandon Sanderson approaches his magic in Mistborn, where things are based on concrete facts and ideas, except for almost even more so where he pulls into his prose and into his magic scientific things that we know today, such as weight, gravity, all those types of things, where a character can lift another piece of an item that is similar to itself. So you have a rock and there's another rock over there. You can link them through something called sympathy and lift both rocks at once. Now, based on the similarity of the substances, different things can happen. It might be a lot heavier to lift that rock because the things aren't as similar. For example, like if you're trying to lift an iron sword with a sword made of wood, it's going to be a lot heavier to lift that wooden sword and the iron sword because wood isn't very similar to iron. So there's a lot of energy lost in the process. And I thought that that was pretty cool. It made perfect sense the first time I read it, and I instantly wanted to know more. They can do things like heat transference and a lot of other cool scientific things with a system of magic. And that was super awesome to me. And one of the best parts about this book was that the main magic system used throughout this story was sympathy, and it was not naming, at least in this first book. Now, I assume we're going to go more into naming as the series progresses to its climax, but in this first book, we are approached mainly with sympathy, and I really enjoyed that type of magic. My absolute favorite part of this book, though, was the backstory we get told about the religion and the mythology of the world. Telu and the demons and his backstory, and how this is integrated into the society and it just feels very natural, and I really enjoyed reading that part. And then we eventually get told a story from a storyteller in the book about the backstory of something called the Chandrian, which is the overall nemesis of the series, I would say. It's the bad guy we don't get much of in this first book, but we assume is going to be the ultimate end climax of the series. And it was just very interesting. I liked the backstory, even though the result ended up in characters that were fairly cliche. But it makes sense because it's based on a mythology, and a lot of mythologies are very similar and pretty cliche. So it was just very interesting reading that and how it implements and connects to the whole world. I just really loved it, and I wanted to see more of it, and I assumed he would eventually get to more of it, but you don't get almost anything after that story is told through the rest of this book, and that was one of the major downsides to me. But I look forward to the other books and seeing how he makes those play out. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to things I disliked about the book. The Name of the Wind was an interesting read. It was exciting. It made me want to keep reading more through most of it, though there were slow sections. But after I finished the book, I was just left with the impression of, what was the story? I felt event after event was happening, but I wasn't getting any sort of normal story with a climax, with a clear bad guy, with a clear end, with a clear goal. It was just event after event of this man's life, of Kvothe's life, without really knowing where we want to go with it. We know he has one goal, and that's to learn more about the Chandrian and that mythology and that past. But we don't get any of that in the first book, so we're left wondering, why did we hear these stories that we heard? What was the point of it? What was the goal? It's a story told almost as a stream of thought, and though it was an interesting read, you're left wanting and lacking at the end. And it just makes me wonder where this story is going to go. I want more of it. I want to get to that actual plot, but I feel like I really wanted more from this book plot-wise. If we look at other things like Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, we look at Harry Potter, yes, the overall story is told through a series of books, but each book in itself is a story with a complete goal, a complete climax, and an ending. That makes us feel okay, like we read the book and that we could set it down. But it wasn't like that with The Name of the Wind. When I was done, I was just left wanting. Like, I hadn't gotten any of that yet. I hadn't worked up to a climax. I hadn't worked up to a complete end of a story. It went back to the roots of storytelling. I literally just redid the same video 4 times. The same part of the video to stop that tree from moving with my cat. And every time she jumps on it right when I start the video. She really just wants to be in this video. You can see her climbing back there. Say hi to her. Kira, say hi. What are you doing, cat? See her poking her head out? There's her face. There we go. That's Kira. That's my cat. Anyway, moving on. I just felt like I wanted more from this book story-wise. It went back to the roots of storytelling, where a person would just count through voice to another person, and they would recount that story to somebody else, and a lot of details are lost, and the overall story structure isn't there. It's just event after event, and those events can be interesting, but nothing really ends up happening by the end of it, if that makes any sense. So that was the major downfall for me of this book. Now let's move on to some of the other negatives of this book that may influence whether you want to read it or not. Though I really enjoyed the book, and a lot of these things I didn't feel until the very end, I think it's worth noting. Setting that aside, the main character Kvothe is a problem for a lot of people. His ending station as Kote, the bartender, is far more interesting than the Kvothe we hear about that he tells in his story. He is a protagonist that just doesn't seem to have any major flaws. Yes, bad things happen to him as a result of some stupid decisions he makes or things he says that get other people mad at him and therefore cause a chain of events to happen and set him in a bad situation. But overall, anything that comes up throughout the story, he tends to be the best at. He's the best learner. He is the best at sympathy. He's the best at so many things that pop up that he progresses quickly through the story. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as early on in the book, in the first chapters, it's stated that, well, one, he was part of a troupe. So, yes, we know he's good at music. We know that he's probably good at acting. And we find out early on with his mentor that he is a very quick learner. So some of those things are established. But that doesn't account for every single thing that happens in the book. There is no major downside to anything that he does. We never get a moment where he doesn't know exactly what to do and doesn't know exactly how to approach a problem and can't solve it with some, I guess, gimmick that he can magically do. And that's a major downside for a lot of people, where they don't like Kvothe because they can't seem to relate to his absolute perfection in a lot of ways. And I can see that, though it's a sort of a guilty pleasure that sometimes I like characters that are just really good at everything, but there were a lot of times in the book where I felt that, why did he have to be the best at that thing? There were other characters with him at the time that could have shined in that moment and progressed the story the exact same way without Kvothe being the one to have to do it and to be the best. Now, that's not really a reason not to pick up the book, though some people just really can't stand Kvothe and they end up putting the book down because it is told through his perspective, which could be as a downside of the book, I guess. I would much rather read the story of the Chandrian and that tragedy that we hear a little bit about throughout the book as the actual story, because it sounds awesome and the character sounds a lot more real than Kvothe does. But we get Kvothe, and that's what we have to deal with. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if Kvothe was the only one, but his main love interest I just couldn't stand. Her name was Denna or Dina. I heard Patrick call her Denna, so that's why I say Denna, but I read it as Dina. Anyway, she just seems like a terrible person in a lot of ways, and I couldn't really stand her, except for like the few moments where they were actually alone together, and she felt more normal to me. But overall, she just feels like a terrible person, and there was a great portion of the book where chapter after chapter was just about her. Very repetitive, very slow, and I didn't enjoy it very much. So those two characters are a huge part of the book, and they're not necessarily the best characters, and a lot of people don't like that. As I said before, there were a lot of times where I enjoyed Kvothe because I have that guilty pleasure of just liking to read characters who are just naturally the best sometimes. But it did get dry and annoying sometimes when it was obvious that other characters could have shined, especially because the supporting cast of characters in this book are actually pretty dang good. I like how their personalities are. I love how they act. I love how they interact with Kvothe, and there's just no reason why they couldn't have shined in a lot of ways too. Anyway, those are pretty much my short thoughts on this book. I could go into a lot of other things, but I don't want to get into spoilers, so I'm going to leave it at that. If you are interested, I do believe that the pros of this book outweigh the cons, which is why I would rate it at 3.5 stars out of 5. And I believe is worth a read through. You will probably grab the book and read it through and enjoy it. And only at the end will you really reflect and feel that you wanted more, which is okay because there's going to be 2 other books. One of them's already out. The next one's coming out in August. So I would recommend it as a read if you like fantasy, if you like interesting prose. It's just a good way to increase your perspective on the fantasy genre, I would recommend it. And it's not that expensive to get a cheap paperback these days, so, or a Kindle version too. It's a pretty fast read, even though it's a long book, mainly because it's told in a way that's interesting. Anyway, all those things aside, I enjoyed the book. I'm wondering right now if I want to go ahead and start the second book, which I have, or if I want to read something else and take a break from it for a while. I'm more inclined to do that, I think, to give it a little bit of a break and then come back to it. Also because the third book doesn't come out till August, and I wonder if the second book's going to really progress the story or if it's going to feel a lot of the same way as the first book did. And yeah, so I will probably take on and read another book. If you have any suggestions, I'm thinking maybe starting The Way of Kings or jumping into any of the other books that I mentioned in a few videos back from my book haul. Anyway, I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving. If you're not American and you had a similar holiday, I hope you enjoyed it too. And if not, I just hope you had a great week. Anyway, it was nice talking to everybody, and I will see you on the other side.